Listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and Lisa Watson is on the buttons. And we just completed the Jazz Zone with T.N. Providence, and he did pay tribute to our brother Kenny Dorham and many others. Etienne Charles. Etienne Charles is a great trumpet player from America, but his roots are, he's really a cousin of Kwame Ture. Yeah, Kwame Ture's cousin. May Charles was born in Panama, and Etienne Charles is related to Ms. Charles. And we're on the line with us is Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne is he has a great new book out called well, I'm losing my memory. My memory is going.
African Americans, a new history of the USA. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. That is. We wanted to talk about that first, but I wanted to talk about as Gerald some questions about. Well, we'll start off with the new book. First of all, I want to ask you, Gerald, what kind of reviews have you received?
Well, the book has just been out for a few weeks, but if I may, given the earthquake that has taken place in Europe in the last few days, let me begin by talking about how U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference in Germany just in the last day or so unleashed a tirade against his host country, speaking of Germany, because there's a firewall constructed by the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, the Greens, with regard to not dealing with the Alternative for Germany party, second in the polls for the February 23rd election, which has flirted, to put it euphemistically, with Nazism, which is taken quite seriously in Germany. Mr. Vance suggested that this was a wrong-headed policy. And what's even more remarkable is that you've had this kind of open interference in the internal affairs of Germany, which is verboten under international law. And yet, I don't see, after monitoring Deutsche Welle of Germany, France 24, BBC, CBC, let's not even talk about the United States, because, of course, the United States, the corporate media is wholly lacking any kind of self-analysis, self-criticism, any sort of analysis of how we got to this point where the United States, supposedly the paragon of liberal democracy, is counseling alliances with neo-Nazis, for example. And I must say, Canada is particularly culpable. Since it shares this border with the United States, it's a neighbor of the United States, we would expect Canadians to be in a position to blow the whistle about the United States of America. But for decades now, Canada has been living a kind of fool's errand, comfortably residing in the bosom of US imperialism, being a kind of junior partner of US imperialism, which to a degree is understandable to the extent that opportunism is understandable. But then you have to wonder not only about the Canadian elite, but by the Canadian left. The Canadian left, of course, is quite critical of royalism, quite critical of the fact that King Charles is the head of state. But you would expect the Canadian left to be similarly critical about republicanism. After all, if they know anything about their history, they would know that in the 19th century, formerly enslaved Africans were fleeing across the border into Canada, and that the Crown was placing them strategically amongst the US-Canadian border because they felt that the Black people would be most prone to fight in a determined fashion against Republican invaders, because if they were defeated, they would likely be re-enslaved. And so if you have even a passing resemblance, a passing knowledge, of Canadian history, you would have to ask yourself, well, if republicanism is so great, why are all these Black people flooding into Canada, escaping republicanism? Why didn't that lead to a critique of republicanism, which is now coming in 2025, tardily, if now, because I'm monitoring the Canadian left, and perhaps you can correct me, I haven't seen any sort of agonizing reappraisal of the lack of knowledge of, or the lack of critique of republicanism in the United States of America, which has obviously jeopardized the national sovereignty of Canada. You would think that with the Canadian audiences booing the playing of the US national anthem at hockey games and basketball games, that the Canadian left would have been in the forefront of trying to understand and explain why that was happening in a deeper level, not just from the superficial level of, Trump wants to make Canada the 51st state, but how did we reach that point? That's the question. And what are the roots of that? That's the question. And that brings me, I'm afraid to say, to Ukraine, where the Defense Secretary of the United States, Pete Hegseth, basically triggered tremors in the North Atlantic bloc by saying in a speech in Europe that NATO membership is off the table for Ukraine. Recall that NATO membership was what triggered the special military operation launched by Moscow in February 2022, that there would be no return to the pre-2014 borders of Ukraine. It's a clear climb down by US imperialism. It's a clear retreat by US imperialism, as Mr. Hegseth hinted. And this is also missing, I'm afraid to say, in all of the critiques of his remarks on both sides of the Atlantic, and even in the left, there's missing what I'm about to tell your audience, which is that it's obviously in the context of trying to emulate Richard Nixon a half century ago, who won over China on an anti-Soviet basis, which led to massive foreign direct investment into China, and also led to China now being in the passing lane and led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So now Mr. Trump wants to do a reverse Kissinger, where he wins over Russia on an anti-China basis. The problem is that Russia is not going to play the role of Maoist China. And by the way, I talked to folks in 2025 who were around at the time of this Nixon deal with Mao, and they still denied that it happened. I mean, it's really something how some people can deny reality. In fact, evidence of the obvious reality that Russia is not going to go along with US imperialism and ganging up against China is that President Xi Jinping of China has just announced his umpteenth trip to Moscow for the holiest day on the Russian calendar, speaking of May 9th, 2025, marking the 80th anniversary of the defeat of fascism in Germany and in Europe. So the problem for US imperialism is that, as I've said before, they remind me of basketball teams that encountered Coach Nolan Richardson of the University of Arkansas Razorbacks. When they put on a full court press, the other team would collapse, sometimes having what appeared to be a collective nervous breakdown. Well, that's what's happening in the United States right now. That's what's happening in the North Atlantic nations right now. There's an emergency meeting in France tomorrow, including Great Britain, where they're going to try to come up with some sort of response to what Trump is doing. At the same time, Mr. Trump's comrades will be negotiating with the Russian foreign minister in Saudi Arabia over the heads of the Ukrainians and the Europeans about not only the fate of Ukraine, but about the fate of Europe in general. And so you have to ask yourself, how did these mighty European countries, including Canada, by the way, find themselves in a situation where they're in such a desperate position that there is even grumbling in the North Atlantic bloc? Now, buckle your seatbelts with regard to this one, that Russia, the United States, and perhaps China will gang up and divvy up Canada and the Western European nations. Now, I don't necessarily buy that, but it's reflective of the collective nervous breakdown that's now afflicting these North Atlantic countries, which have not anticipated the rise of Trump 2.0, although the signs were plainly and clearly evident all along the way. If they had listened more to this program, Diasporic Music, over the years, they would have had a clue, but of course, they have not, and now they may have to pay the ultimate price. Now, the problem for US imperialism is not only do I feel that they have misjudged Russia in terms of its ability to join in a gang up against China, they are also taking on too many adversaries. That is to say, they've alienated the Western Europeans, they've alienated the Canadians, they've alienated the Panamanians. They're in the process of alienating the Mexicans, alienating South Africa by worsening relations with Pretoria because of this land reform bill that is yet to go into execution, with Mr. Trump, as you know, opening the door for a flood of so-called white refugees steaming and streaming into the United States of America. And so,
Gerald, could I ask you one thing? And can't we say that this all can't be blamed on Trump? Didn't Biden start this? The U.S., the other administration start this?
Sure. I mean, but at the same time, we have to recognize that you should not personalize politics. Trump has a different base than Biden's base. And as a result, you cannot, I mean, for example, you can't say on the one hand, as many of our friends on the left do, that we not only had a change in administration, we had a regime change. In other words, we're in the foothills of fascism. And then they turn around and say, well, Biden is the same as Trump. Well, if there has been no change, why are you calling it a regime change then? I mean, it's sort of illogical. And in any case, let's take DEI, for example. Now, diversity, equity, and inclusion and its close cousin, affirmative action, have been policy in the United States for decades now, particularly under Democratic presidents. And what you need to realize is that even though some liberals and social democrats and even so-called black leftists are applauding the overturning of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, the fact is this was no gift from the liberal wing of the United States of America, which some have suggested. This was not necessarily liberal counterinsurgency tactics. It was the fact that the black working class, which had been barred from many unions, which had Caucasian-only clauses, demanded that there be an end run around the class collaboration that united the Euro-American working class and ruling class, which barred black people from certain unions, particularly in the construction trades. And the response was affirmative action and DEI. And the same thing holds true for boosting certain blacks into managerial ranks. I mean, if you listen to our friends on the left, they think whenever we win a reform, either we should get rid of the reform because that'll make people angry and so they'll storm into the streets, or they'll act like it was a gift from the ruling class and that people didn't struggle for it. So I guess we should get rid of
Dr. Horne, I don't want to cut you, but I want to mention the fact that you wrote a book, Reversing Discrimination, the Case for Affirmative Action, in 1992. I'm looking at it right now.
Well, a new version is coming out in 2025. But I think this is part of the ideological weakness. We should say, let's get rid of Social Security. So all the old codgers, Social Security is a pension that comes into the bank account of people over the age of 65 in the United States on a monthly basis. If you didn't have Social Security, old people would be eating dog food because that's their only source of income. So I guess we should say, get rid of Social Security. It was just a gift from the ruling class, and that the old codgers would be in their wheelchairs out in the streets calling for the overturning of US imperialism if you get rid of Social Security. I mean, this is nonsense. This shows the sort of ideological vacuousness and emptiness that afflicts too many in our ranks. But in any case, to return to this main thread, I think that what we also see with this entente, this meeting tomorrow in Saudi Arabia between Russian and US representatives, you may see the closure of a centuries-long policy of seeking to ignore the fact that Russia was destined to be the major power on the European continent. That is to say, that was the import of Napoleon's invasion of Russia 2 centuries ago. That was the import of Britain funding the Japanese attack on Russia in 1904. That was the import of Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler invaded Russia. That was the import of the entire Cold War. And of course, the Western European nations had reason to be opposed to Russia because as they were getting fat off the transatlantic slave trade and the looting of the Americas, Russia was moving east towards what is now its window in the Pacific, speaking of Vladivostok, not established until 1861. And so what happened is that just as the Soviet Union had a material interest in supporting African liberation as a way to weaken its antagonists in Western Europe, pre-revolutionary Russia had a similar motivation. As I'm going to point out in a book I'll be writing within months, if you want to understand how the Abyssinians, the Ethiopians in the 1890s were able to beat back the Italians, look no further than the fact that the Abyssinians were armed to the teeth by the Russians, including machine guns that were used to mow down these Italian invaders because they had a material interest in defeating their antagonists to the West. Now, this is just the ABCs of international politics. Just as I said a moment or two ago, I have folks I talk to nowadays who still don't understand that China cut a deal with the United States decades ago, which led to the Chinese rise. However, the time has now come to recognize that the moment for ignoring reality has disappeared, and perhaps a certain kind of self-criticism is in order. And I would say, once again, particularly on the part of our friends across the border in Canada, and that includes the Canadian left, I'm afraid to say, because I think too many have accepted this liberal mythology of United States constructing this so-called liberal democracy post-1776. And then you have this companion idea amongst certain forces on the left that if you're on the left, that means you're supposed to be marginal. And that if anybody pays attention to you, that means you must be doing something wrong, which means that they cannot understand, say, a filmmaker like Raoul Peck, who, of course, not only produced Lumumba, not only produced Exterminate All the Brutes, which played on HBO, which the left saw as a sellout, which was a sweeping castigation of settler colonialism. Perhaps his least known, but one of his better films is The Young Karl Marx. So if he was a sellout, how was he able to get a film produced praising Karl Marx, for example? I mean, as I said, there's a lot of confusion in this country, which is one of the reasons why these Canadians and Western Europeans are on the brink of catastrophe. I should also say that part of the problem has been that a lack of understanding of the United States of America as a settler colonial regime. Just as in Israel, you not only need a majority in the Knesset, you need a Jewish majority that ignores the interests of the 20% Arab population. It's not sufficiently recognized in the United States that you not only need a majority of the electorate, you need a majority of settler descendants, which the Republicans have a stranglehold over. The Democrats have not been able to disrupt that stranglehold, which is one of the reasons why they're out in the wilderness. There's a refusal to do an actual class analysis of the United States, despite the fact that some of our friends on the left are always clamoring about the dearth of class analysis. That is to say, if you look at what's happening with Trump, he's overturning the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, which protects ordinary consumers, such as myself, your relatives in Los Angeles, Norman, from the depredations of banks, for example. And that benefits the 1%, his overturning that bureau. But at the same time, the working class, middle class base, they feel that they're going to benefit from the overturning of DEI, because that means that the mediocre elements in the Trump base can get jobs and promotions over the interests of Black people, for example, over the interests of non-minority women, for example. In any case, let me stop there because I've gone on for too long, but this is just such an important, such a profound moment. We're teetering on the brink of disaster, at least Canada and the Western Europeans are, and it's time for a sobering and agonizing reappraisal.
Could I say something? I wanted to say that, don't you think that our friends on the left do not recognize, I think what Lenin said, that America was a prison of nations, and our friends on the left, some of them saw there was an argument at one time that the Black Belt South, and then they dropped that and said that the Africans in America were a national minority. Am I correct in saying that? They don't. Well, what I'm saying is that they don't see the question of settler colonialism has not really been recognized, whereas the nationalists that everybody criticizes, like Carlos Cooks and people like that, may have had that part right, although they were wrong on the anti-communism, etc.
Well, I will say this: one of the most profound flaws in left discourse today is a refusal to engage settler colonialism, which means that they do not engage the question of class collaboration, which means they cannot explain why Trump gets 77 million votes in November 2024. However, if they looked at the US Civil War, for example, they would know that thousands and thousands of poor and working class and middle class Euro-Americans fought to preserve slavery, even though slavery would mean that they were competing against workers who did not receive wages, driving down their wage level, not to mention that they could be replaced altogether by an enslaved African. In other words, to a certain degree, they were so drunk on the poison of class collaboration, they could not envision what their own class interests were. And to a certain extent, that same plot is playing out today, which is one of the reasons why, on the one hand, you have some of our friends on the left talk about the United States being this great leap forward for humanity when it was created. And of course, have a person like myself being subjected to threats and attacks of all manner for disagreeing. And yet they're not able to understand or even explain, if it was such a great leap forward for humanity, then where did it go wrong with us being on the brink of fascism today? Unless you disagree with that notion, and unless you think that what Trump is doing is, as some of our friends on the left say, he's fighting the good fight against the deep state, for example. I mean, really, that's what some folks on the left are actually saying, believe it or not.
Well, I wanted to make an announcement that there's going to be a meeting in Toronto of young people, commemorating the defeat of US imperialism in Vietnam. And this is organized by young Vietnamese, young people from the Caribbean. It's going to be quite a meeting. It's going to be at it's going to be on February the 21st, and I will give you a report on it, Dr. Horne.
Well, let me also say that I evaded the question you asked to begin with in my book, African Americans and the New History of the United States of America. But in a sense, I did not evade it, because that book, in some ways, elaborates on many of the themes that I've just spoken about in the last few minutes. Class collaboration amongst the settlers undergirding settler colonialism, the fact that enslaved Africans, because of the persecution and oppression to which our ancestors were subjected to, were forced to engage in class struggle of various sorts, from malingering to militant resistance, to seeking to overthrow the regime, to allying with foreign powers, not to mention allying with indigenous nations, for example. And that, adding to the list of one of the reasons why we've been treated so atrociously, is the fact that class struggle and class collaboration do not mix very well. And it inevitably leads to those who are engaged in class struggle being subjected to misinformation, disinformation, such as this wrong-headed support for Trump's attack on DEI, which I will not reiterate because it's so ludicrous and ridiculous that it's hardly worth exploring. So that, in sum, is the essence of this book that stretches from hundreds of years past up to the present moment.
Now we are raising funds. This is we don't have that much time left, but once again, this is Black History Month. It's also fundraising for Black Power 96. In your judgment, why should people support diasporic music in particular and Black Power 96 in general?
Well, I would say if Mark Carney and Justine Trudeau and Melanie Joly and Chrystia Freeland had any sense, they'd be sending checks right now to Black Power 96. Because if they had been listening to Black Power 96 over the years, they would not be contemplating the possible prospect of liquidation of Canadian national sovereignty. What I'm saying is that Black Power 96 and diasporic music are an oasis in a parched desert of disinformation and misinformation, and certainly deserves the full-throated support of this audience, and I would also add audiences worldwide.
And
Melinda, you have any questions? We have a
yeah, we don't have a lot of time. Did you want to talk a little bit about the film festival?
Oh yes, I'll be heading out to the festival today. I missed Stanley Nelson's 2 new films, one on San Juan Hill, where the great pianist Thelonious Monk was brought up after moving from North Carolina to Manhattan. San Juan Hill, now a destroyed Black neighborhood, which houses Lincoln Center and other edifices of the U.S. ruling class in New York City. And another film on funk music, which I missed last night, which apparently turned out the house, going into the various aspects of funk music, including interviews with neuroscientists talking about how it affects the brain in a positive direction, which is, of course, another advertisement for diasporic music, by the way. I also saw my friend Billy Woodbury's film Mario, on Mario Pinto de Andrade, who is an Angolan revolutionary, a founder of the MPLA, the ruling party. It's quite remarkable. Billy, of course, is in self-imposed exile in Lisbon, and while in Lisbon, he decided to take up this project. It's a real contribution. Soundtrack to Coup d'etat also played here, but I had already seen that one. I missed the film on Stevenson, the great Cuban heavyweight boxer, sadly enough.
Exactly. Right? Yeah.
But I'm going to see tomorrow the film on Dikembe Mutombo, the Congolese basketball player and humanitarian. It's the festival has had fewer films this year for whatever reason. Maybe it's a reaction to the fires, which slowed down LA tremendously. Also, the festival moved from the Crenshaw district into Culver City, which is sort of like yuppie paradise, and that might have cut down on attendance. But in any case, it still stands tall as a monument to the Black experience, the Pan-African experience, Black creativity, etc.
I wanted to say that Theophilus Stevenson, the great boxer from Cuba, his roots, besides being from Africa, were also from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That's where maybe even his parents.
Yeah, sadly, I missed that film, but I assume I'll catch up with it somewhere along the way. By the way, Woodbury's films, including Mario, are playing the Criterion Channel, and Stanley Nelson's films, usually they get wide distribution, so you should keep an eye out for them.
I was blessed to have met Mr. Woodbury, I think in 2012. I met him a couple of times, and he's friends with Charles Burnett, the great filmmaker Charles Burnett. I think they are. Well, I don't think they are very close.
Well, sure. They're part of the LA Rebellion that came out of UCLA. Filmmakers, including Holly Jarima, now of Washington, D.C., formerly of the Faculty of Howard University. I'm looking forward to seeing, he did this multi-part film on the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in the 1930s, for example. I think it's 10 hours long, believe it or not.
10 hours.
Correct. So it'll be having its debut in a few months.
And is there anything you want to add, Melinda?
Well, we only have 2 minutes left. I don't know if you wanted to touch on quickly about your research in China, like your China research.
Well, yeah, one of the reasons why I'm out here in the Southland is that I visited the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. It's not my first visit there, looking at their files on China and looking at what's interesting, of course, is not only the technology transfers from the United States to China, which helped to create this juggernaut. It's also how China was playing off one capitalist country against another. For example, at one point, it was telling the United States, well, look, if you don't supply China with a nuclear reactor, we'll get it from France. Recall that France had recognized China in 1964, years before the United States did. So this is part of this research. Also, I don't know if I told you, I did research at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., in the files of the recently outed Black CIA agent, Richard Gibson.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, I did tell you about that. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. So stay tuned for that book. It'll probably take a few years to produce, though.
I guess that is it, sir. So we will speak with you next week.
Good luck to you.
All right, and we'd like to thank Lisa Watson for...
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.